I only needed shelter. But this broken loft already knew my family's name.
She was 25 and hunted. No home, no references, no final paycheck, just a canvas satchel and $7 she had hidden beneath the lining before the locks were changed. And with that $7, she bought a forgotten needlepoint canvas painter's loft near Nantucket Harbor in Nantucket County, Massachusetts, a place that had fallen from municipal maps in 1978. The north sill had split beneath the windows. Rain had opened a brown seam across the ceiling. The county condemned it on October 3, 2023, with demolition planned for the following spring. Inside a hollow basswood stretcher bar, sealed for nearly 40 years, waited money, a painted garden, and a sentence precise enough to alter the shape of her remaining life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ines Marrow had been learning to disappear her whole life without knowing it. As a child in New Bedford, she made herself small beside the radiator while her mother counted bills. She drew thumbnail-sized flowers on grocery receipts, holding them to the window to add veins to the leaves. Exactness became a place no one could enter without permission. Her father left before she learned multiplication. Her mother, Celia, met hardship by cleaning what was already clean. Survival, to her, meant pleasing employers and troubling no landlord. Only Aunt Sabine offered another measure. Sabine Voss painted needlepoint canvases above a frame shop where Saturday light settled on jars of brushes. Each weekend, Ines watched her stretch mono canvas over basswood bars, tighten opposite corners and tap brass tacks until a ruler would not rock on the mesh. Sabine painted one intersection at a time with a three-haired brush, thinning colour enough to move but never flood a hole. At noon, they ate pears over the sink. Then Ines practiced on scraps while Sabine corrected her softly. Long stitches are what impatient people use to hide empty places, Sabine once said. Ines understood that she was not speaking only of thread. A life, too, could fail where someone hurried across what required patient filling. Sabine died in February 2016. Before Ines reached town, the landlord cleared the workroom. Frames, samples, brushes, and ledgers vanished into an estate lot. Celia would not contest it. Ines kept one bent brass tack found beneath the stairs. 7 years later, she handled records for a coastal engineering contractor outside Boston. Her foreman, Grant Pell, wore grey shirts pressed like armour. He never shouted. He stood too close and placed one finger on the line he wanted changed. When runoff reports showed solvent above the permitted threshold, he ordered Ines to replace the dates and remove 3 photographs. She refused. 2 days later, an internal notice accused her of deleting project records. Her badge stopped working before lunch. Her wages were withheld pending investigation, and Pell watched from behind the glass wall while security placed her satchel on the pavement. On March 14, 2023, she returned to her rented room and found a new padlock on the front door. Celia stood beside the landlord holding Ines's enamel mug, the blue one with a chipped rim. Her mother would not meet her eyes. The landlord set the mug on the step and said, "You brought trouble here. Take it somewhere else." Celia's hands remained folded over her coat buttons. She did not argue, did not offer the sofa, did not ask where Ines would sleep. When Ines picked up the mug, her mother stepped back half a pace so their sleeves would not touch. That movement lasted less than a second. It was the part Ines remembered. For 6 weeks she moved through Massachusetts. In Boston she slept upright in South Station until a guard recognized her shoes. In Quincy she spent $9 at a laundromat and rested behind the dryers. In Plymouth, she used a church basement with 12 folding cots, leaving before breakfast because the form asked for an employer. Her money narrowed by exact degrees. $43 became $31 after bus fare and soup, then $19 after cough medicine and 2 hostel nights in Hyannis. She washed her blouse in public sinks one night. She slept in an unlocked beach changing room as wind pushed sand under the door. By week 5, she had $11 and a raw heel. The hidden 7 remained untouched. Rain drove her into the Hyannis Public Library on an April afternoon. She chose a table near the local papers because the heating vent worked there. Between notices for boat engines and estate chairs, a 3-line classified had been marked with blue pencil, county disposal, condemned artist Loft. And Nantucket cash deed $7. Buyer assumes all risk. The amount looked less like a price than a test. Ines copied the clerk's number onto the back of an overdue book slip, then studied the ferry schedule until the printed rows stopped trembling. The trip would spend nearly everything else. Remaining where she was would spend her more slowly. At closing time, she filled her mug at the fountain, tied the canvas satchel tighter, and walked toward the terminal before caution could find language. By morning, the Loft would be hers, if it survived long enough to receive her. The ferry left Hyannis under a low ceiling of cloud, its engines pressing a steady vibration through the metal bench beneath Ines. She kept the satchel looped around one wrist and watched the mainland diminish into grey water. At Nantucket, she could not afford the island bus, so she walked 6 miles west with the enamel mug knocking against her hip. Rain found her before dusk. She slept that night in the open bay of a hay barn off Nantucket Road, curled behind 3 square bales while the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. The hay smelled of dust, salt and mice. Each time the wind lifted the loose roofing tin, the barn gave a long metallic breath. She reached town the next morning with straw in her hair and one sock darkened by blood. Nantucket had already begun its early season preparations. Murray's Toggery displayed folded sweaters behind clean glass. Mitchell's Book Corner had a delivery stacked by the door. Bartlett's Farm Market was unloading crates. The pharmacy on Main Street raised its striped awning, while Black-Eyed Susans sent the smell of coffee and browned butter into the wet air. The county offices occupied a brick building whose steps had been worn shallow at the centre. Ines paused beneath the entrance long enough to wipe mud from her shoes with a paper napkin. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over counters divided by scratched acrylic panels. A woman with silver hair pinned by 2 black combs sat beneath a brass nameplate reading Eleanor Briggs, County Property Clerk. She wore a red wool thimble on her left index finger, though there was no sewing anywhere in sight. "You called about the loft," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Briggs removed a narrow folder from beneath her desk and aligned it carefully with the blotter. "You understand there is no working electrical service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested since 1989? "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the structure is condemned and cannot be insured in its present condition?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will not refund the purchase price, even if the building collapses before you reach it?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Briggs studied her for several seconds, not unkindly. "You have the $7? Ines opened the inner seam of the satchel and drew out the bills. 1 5, 2 1s, flattened from years of hiding. Mrs. Briggs counted them once. She placed the single dollar bills in the cash drawer and held the 5 beneath the desk lamp, as though checking whether it belonged to the same world as everything else. The deed contained 3 typed pages and 6 places for initials. Ines read each sentence. The county retained no liability. The buyer accepted environmental, structural, and historical restrictions. The property line followed an old drainage ditch no longer visible on modern surveys. When she signed, Mrs., Briggs pressed a brass stamp into a black pad and brought it down hard enough to shake the counter. The seal left a raised circle beside Ines's name. "Take Main Street west," the clerk said. "Turn onto Nantucket Road. At the old mill, follow Eel Point Road until you see a gravel lane with 2 leaning walnut trees. The loft is behind the former Harrow frame shop. Do not use the front steps. They have separated from the sill." She began sliding the deed into an envelope, then stopped. "Marrow," she said. Ines looked up. "Mrs." Briggs removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the edge of her sleeve. "Was Sabine Marrow related to you?" "She was my aunt. She used Voss after she married." The clerk's fingers remained still around the glasses. "Sabine painted canvases here when I was young. Chair seats, bell pulls, evening bags. She could place 5 shades of blue in a wave no larger than my thumbnail." Ines felt the bent brass tack inside her pocket. Mrs. Briggs glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. The loft belonged to Adeline Marrow, Sabine's grandmother perhaps. It changed hands through unpaid taxes, then passed to the county when the last recorded occupant died. Sabine came here once asking about it, but the title was tangled. That was more than 30 years ago. She never told me. People do not always speak about the places they could not save. "Mrs." Briggs returned the glasses to her face. She slipped the $5 bill into the drawer, then placed one of the 2 singles beneath the transparent desk pad rather than with the other money. "For the record," she said, "the sale is complete." Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. Ines followed the clerk's directions past grey-shingled houses and stone walls furred with lichen. A man pruning a hedge looked at her satchel and then at the deed envelope in her hand. He wore one yellow glove and held the other between his teeth. "You're heading to the painter's place," he said. "I believe so. Name's Owen Cuff. House with the green gate," he pointed with the shears. At his feet, a heavy brown dog opened one eye. "That's Locket. She'll bark once, then decide you're boring." Locket barked once. Beyond the green gate, Eel Point Road narrowed. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the 2 walnut trees appeared just as Mrs. Briggs had described them. One bent inland, the other carrying a split where lightning had entered years before. The lane ended at a weathered frame shop with boarded windows. Behind it stood the loft. It was a narrow 2-story building, approximately 24 feet long and 16 feet wide, clad in cedar shingles gone almost silver. The roof sagged slightly along its northern pitch. A brick chimney rose from the rear wall with 3 courses missing mortar. Above the crooked entrance hung a wooden sign, its remaining letters barely visible beneath peeling green paint. Marrow hand-painted canvases. The front steps leaned away from the door. Ines circled the building and found a rear entrance beneath an iron awning. The key from Mrs. Briggs resisted twice before turning. The door opened inward with a soft tearing sound as old paint separated from the jamb. Cold air came first, carrying dried linseed oil, mouse nesting, and the mineral smell of damp plaster. Her fingers brushed a wall gritty with salt bloom. Somewhere overhead, a loose sash tapped the frame in the wind. When she breathed through her mouth, she tasted dust. The front room held a cast-iron stove, a pine table, and shelves bowed under bundles of paper. A wool runner had faded into a pale path across the floor. In the back room, north-facing windows looked toward a strip of marsh and distant water. Long work tables stood beneath them, still fitted with clamps. A roll of torn mono canvas hung from one clamp like a surrendered flag. Ines touched it. The mesh broke beneath her thumb with a dry whisper. She found no food, no mattress, and no water, she trusted. Near sunset, she swept a rectangle of floor beside the stove with a brittle hand broom. She laid her coat beneath her shoulders and used the satchel as a pillow. The deed remained inside her shirt, where her body heat softened the paper. Darkness arrived without electricity. The loft answered the weather in small sounds, the window tap, the roof's restrained complaint, the faint movement of walnut branches against the shingles. She listened until each noise had a location. Before sleep, she raised one hand and placed her palm flat against the floorboards. The building was cold, damaged, and legally unfit for habitation. It was also the first place from which no one had ordered her to leave. Life is filled by the smallest stitches, not by long hurried threads. At first light, Ines carried the enamel mug outside and followed the flattened grass behind the loft until she found the well. Its stone curb leaned toward the marsh, and the iron pump handle resisted like a rusted hinge. She worked it 37 times before brown water coughed from the spout. On the 41st stroke, the stream ran clear enough to see the scratches inside the mug. She boiled it anyway. The outhouse stood beyond the lightning-split walnut, listing 6 inches to the east. Its door had swollen shut, so she shaved the lower edge with a broken palette knife until it opened. By the 3rd day she knew which floorboards complained beneath her weight. One near the stove gave a short click, 2 by the stairs groaned together, and the board beneath the north windows made no sound at all. That silent board bothered her. She left it untouched and walked back toward town with the deed envelope folded inside her coat. Cuff's Hardware occupied a narrow building near the harbour, where drawers of screws rose to the ceiling, and the air held rope fibre, machine oil and coffee. Owen Cuff stood behind the counter, the same yellow glove tucked through his belt. His left eyebrow had been divided by an old white scar, giving him a permanent look of mild doubt. "You found the place standing," he said. "It was still standing when I left. Then the county undersold it." Ines placed a list on the counter. She had written only what could not be borrowed from the loft itself. Owen read it, then looked at the coins in her palm. "You'll need more than this." "I know." He opened a ledger bound in black cloth. "I can give you a 30-day account. Materials only. No decorative notions, no electric tools, and no pretending you forgot the date. I will pay it. Most people say thank you first. Thank you. I will pay it." He wrote Ines Marrow across the top of a page and slid her a thin book with a stained orange cover, repairs for the owner of an old house. "This one's free," he said. "The author believes gravity can be negotiated with. Ignore those chapters." She bought a chimney brush for $8.75, 20 feet of fiberglass rod for $6.40, a steel scraper for $2.10, stove cement for $4.85, and a bundle of split kindling for 90 cents. Owen added a pair of canvas gloves without entering them in the ledger. The chimney came first because warmth would make every other failure easier to face. Ines removed the stovepipe and stuffed a damp rag into the opening to keep soot from spilling into the room. On the roof she tied herself to the sound chimney base with clothesline found in a cupboard, then lowered the round wire brush through the flue 1 rod at a time. The first pull released only powder. The second broke loose a plate of creosote as broad as her hand. For 4 hours she pushed and twisted, working through a constriction just above the smoke shelf. Black flakes struck the rag below with the sound of dry rain. Twice the brush lodged between uneven bricks. Each time she stopped pulling, rotated the rod a quarter turn, and eased it upward rather than snapping the ferrule. By noon, her gloves were glossy with soot. By 3. Her shoulders shook when she lifted the brush. She climbed down, opened the clean-out door, and removed 2 enamel bowls of creosote, along with a mouse nest woven from blue wool. The flue drew a match flame upward. She resealed the stovepipe with cement, waited until evening, and built the smallest fire she could, newspaper, 6 slivers of kindling, Then 2 pieces of split oak found beneath the stairs. Smoke entered the room for 3 seconds before the cold column released and pulled it cleanly upward. The iron stove began ticking as it warmed. Ines sat on the floor and watched the rusted top change from black to a softer grey. She heated well water in a dented saucepan, stirred in oats purchased with her last loose change, and added half an apple Doris at the café had pressed into her hand that morning. It was her first hot meal in 4 days. Afterward, she carried the lamp into the back workroom. She had avoided taking inventory until heat made the building feel less like evidence. Now she moved from object to object without disturbing their order. A porcelain palette lay beneath the north windows, its wells hardened with ochre, rose madder, and 5 separate blues. A magnifying lens stood on a brass arm above the main table. Bundles of sable brushes rested in a marmalade jar, with their tips wrapped in tissue. There were brass tacks sorted by length in pill bottles, a wooden gauge marked in tenths of an inch, 2 linen aprons stiffened by paint, and a rack containing 19 stretcher bars. Near the wall leaned a completed canvas of grey whaling ships under a copper sky. Several needle holes remained open, though the painting itself had been finished. Ines held it toward the window and saw that every colour stopped before the intersections closed. Whoever had painted it understood restraint. The largest frame in the room carried a 3-metre roll of mono canvas browned at the edges. 4 basswood stretcher bars held it taut, each bar broader than those used for chair seats or pillows. The upper bar sagged slightly in the middle. Ines pressed one corner. The canvas answered with a low drum note. She tapped the left side of the upper bar with the handle of a brush. Solid wood returned a blunt knock. 6 inches farther in, the sound sharpened. At the centre, it became hollow. She tapped again. Hollow. The bar should have weighed perhaps 4 pounds. When she released the clamps and lifted it from the frame, it dragged heavily against her palms. She carried it to the pine table, balanced it across 2 chairs, and measured the ends. No joint appeared in the grain. A circular cedar disc, scarcely wider than a quarter, had been fitted into the underside and painted the colour of old wood. It sat beneath a crust of dried sizing, invisible from standing height. Ines used the bent brass tack from Sabine's stairs to clear the disc's edge. The cedar plug turned. She did not pry it. She worked a drop of lamp oil into the seam, waited 10 minutes, and pressed the tack into 2 shallow holes cut opposite each other. The disc moved another 1/8 of a turn. A dry breath escaped from inside the bar, carrying cedar, paper, and something metallic. She laid both hands flat on the table until they stopped trembling. Then she unscrewed the plug. The first package emerged only when she tilted the bar and tapped its end against a folded apron. It was wrapped in waxed linen and tied with blue thread. A second package followed, then a narrow tin box, and finally a rolled sheet protected by brown paper. Ines opened the linen bundle first. Inside lay 3 miniature brushes with silver ferrules, a bone burnisher, a steel laying tool, and Sabine's brass mesh gauge. The gauge carried a crescent-shaped nick near the 12-count mark. Ines had watched her aunt make that nick one Saturday when the tool slipped beneath a framing tack. The second package contained skeins of silk, each wound on hand-cut cards and labelled in a fine brown hand, marsh green, widow's violet, harbour fog, quince skin. She placed them in a straight row. The rolled sheet was a hand-painted botanical garden on cream mono canvas. Paths curved between glasshouses, herb beds, pear espaliers, and a pond no larger than her palm. Every leaf had been placed on a separate intersection. The full design would require millions of stitches, perhaps years of work, along the lower margin. Beneath the painted border, someone had written, Kuok sum duk lup day bang những mũi kim bay nhỏ nhut, chứ không phải những đường chỉ dài vội vã. Ines could not read the language, but the careful hand held her attention. A translation had been added beneath it in pencil. Life is filled by the smallest stitches, not by long hurried threads. She left the tin box until last. Its lid had been sealed with a strip of brittle linen tape. She cut along one edge with the palette knife. Inside were paper packets, cloth rolls, and a white envelope addressed only to the one who opens this. The first packet held silver dollars. Ines carried everything to the cleared section of floor beside the stove. She spread one apron beneath the money and counted each piece twice, making columns with the mesh gauge. There were $20 gold pieces wrapped in pairs, $10 Liberty Eagles, silver Morgan dollars, and worn $half darkened around their rims. Beneath them lay banknotes pressed between sheets of wax paper. The last cloth roll contained a purple heart dated 1944, its ribbon faded almost grey. The total was $22,800. Not $22,799. Not $22,801. Exactly $22,800. She counted it a third time because accuracy was the only response she trusted. The envelope remained unopened. Night had covered the marsh. Ines returned the coins to their packets, placed the medal beside the painted garden, and carried the sealed letter outside. She walked beyond the walnut trees to where the ground lowered toward the water. The tide was moving in. Harbour lights shivered across its surface, stretching and breaking whenever the wind passed. She held the letter against her coat but did not turn it toward the moon. Some things asked to be found. Others asked for mourning. Life is filled by the smallest stitches, not by long hurried threads. Morning entered through the north windows in a thin white band. Ines set the unopened envelope beside the stove and warmed her hands before touching it. The handwriting on the front had the same narrow capitals Sabine used on paint labels, with the same long downward stroke on the letter N. She broke the seal with the bone burnisher. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the basswood bar, then the loft has outlasted me, and perhaps you have outlasted something as well. My name is Adeline Ruth Marrow. Doctor Samuel Keene at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston told me in March of 1983 that the cancer had entered my liver and that I should put my affairs in order. Doctors use that phrase because they cannot see the disorder hidden inside an ordinary-looking room. The women before me worked with their hands. Ruth Bell painted morning samplers in Salem in 1848. Her daughter, Esther Bell Marrow, came to Nantucket in 1871 and painted chair canvases for whaling families. Esther's daughter Lydia opened this loft in 1903. I was born above it in 1927 and my granddaughter Sabine learned here before she could read. 4 generations, 4 kinds of silence, and 1 table beneath the northern light. The trade closed on September 17th, 1951, when the last commercial order was collected and no new one came. I continued privately, but the sign remained dark. More than 30 years have passed without a customer crossing the threshold. My husband, Thomas, was killed near Saint-Lô in France during the Second World War. The Purple Heart belongs to him. I kept it near my paints because grief also requires a place at the work table. If you intend to paint canvas, stretch it evenly and never trust your eye alone. Measure corner to corner. The diagonals must agree within 1/8 of an inch. Thin acrylic colour no more than 1 part water to 4 parts paint. Let each layer dry 20 minutes before placing another beside it. Keep the room between 65 and 72 degrees, or the sizing will tighten unevenly. Most of all, leave every needle hole open. A painted canvas that cannot be stitched is only a picture pretending to be useful. The money came from small orders, careful saving, and the sale of my mother's house. Use it slowly. Inheritance is not what the dead hand over. It is the work they leave unfinished and the care required to continue it honestly. The garden canvas is not a test. It is an invitation. Begin with one leaf if that is all you can manage. A true pattern does not demand haste. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adeline Ruth Marrow, June 8, 1983. Ines read the letter twice. The second time, she paused where Sabine's name appeared and rested one finger beneath it. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, smoothing each edge with the bone tool before returning them to the envelope. The letter mentioned a marker behind the loft, set where Lydia had planted feverfew beside the marsh path. Ines crossed the back room and forced open the swollen rear door. The ground beyond it was crowded with salt grass and last year's stems, but a line of flat stones led toward the water. She found the marker half buried beneath winter debris. It was a narrow granite slab no higher than her knee. A thimble, a paintbrush, and a threaded needle had been carved across its face. Beneath them were 4 names and dates, the earliest belonging to Ruth Bell. At the bottom, almost erased by lichen, stood Sabine Voss, 1954-2016. Ines knelt and cleared the letters with the edge of her sleeve. No grave lay beneath the stone. It was a record of the women who had worked there, placed where each could see the marsh from the northern window. Inside, she chose one of the old heirloom objects from the table, a small brass oil lamp with a wick wheel shaped like a flower. The reservoir still held a finger's depth of clean kerosene. She trimmed the blackened wick, struck a match, and lowered the glass chimney. The flame steadied. Its light reached the painted garden first, then the silver ferrules of the brushes, then the white envelope. She began to see the road behind her not as a chain of closed doors, but as a series of hands that had kept her moving. Doris from the café had pressed an apple into her palm without asking for an explanation. Owen had opened a credit ledger after seeing the emptiness of her coin purse. Mrs. Briggs had kept one of the purchase dollars beneath her desk pad, as though the transaction deserved remembering. Even the unknown farmer had left the hay barn bay unlatched on a cold night. None of them had rescued her. Each had merely made the next hour possible. Perhaps you remember a kindness like that, a meal left near a door, a ride given without questions, or one quiet sentence spoken when you had almost reached the end of what you could carry. What was the smallest kindness that helped you continue? Ines wrapped the purple heart in its faded cloth and placed it beside her sleeping coat. The brushes, gauge, letter, and botanical canvas rested on the pine table within reach of the lamp. That night she slept with the heirlooms beside her, while the flame cast the stretcher bars as long patient lines across the wall. The first snow came on December 2nd, 7 inches laid evenly across the marsh and the loft's northern roof. Ines woke to melted water ticking into a saucepan beside the stove. She read the roofing chapter in Owen's orange repair manual 3 times, first for meaning, then for sequence, and once more for the mistakes the author assumed a beginner would make. The roof measured 16 by 26 feet along each pitch, allowing for overlap and waste. She calculated 11 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 12 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Owen checked her figures without praising them. From beneath the counter, he produced a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a handle darkened by years of sweat. "My brother's," he said. "He will not be needing it." A retired roofer named Elias Pike arrived the next morning wearing a wool cap pulled over both ears. His right hand had only 3 full fingers. He refused payment by lifting one shoulder and starting up the ladder. For 11 days they worked from first safe light until the frost made the shingles slick. They sistered the weakened north rafter with a straight length of fir bolted through at 16-inch intervals. Elias snapped a chalk line across the felt and taught Ines to set each nail with 3 strokes: place, drive, finish. That nail's proud. Ines leaned closer. Pull it. She learned to offset the joints, leave the correct weather exposure, and reject any shingle whose grain ran sideways. On December 14th, they fixed the final ridge course beneath a sky the colour of pewter. That night snow struck the roof and remained outside. January exposed the chimney's deeper weakness. Several bricks had begun to spall, their faces peeling away in red shells, while the mortar between them powdered beneath Ines's thumb. Smoke still drew, but a hard freeze could open the joints enough to admit sparks beneath the roof. Elias showed her how to rake the failing mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch without bruising the brick edges. For the repair, they mixed 3 parts washed sand, one part hydraulic lime, and 1 part fireclay near the upper flue where heat would be greatest. The work took 3 weeks, most afternoons remaining in the 20s. Ines warmed the bricks with wrapped hot water bottles before laying mortar so the joints would not freeze before curing. She worked barehanded because gloves dulled the pressure needed to shape the narrow beds. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb, and she stood beside the stove until pain returned through them in bright pulses. She replaced 4 ruined bricks, reset the loose crown, and packed the final joints with a pointing iron ground narrow enough to enter the old work. Damp burlap protected the repairs from drying too quickly. On January 29th, she built a test fire using 1 sheet of paper and 3 dry oak splits. The flame climbed without hesitation. Outside, the smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, clean line and cleared the ridge before the wind could flatten it. Beneath soot, plaster dust, and a grey skin of neglect, the loft's floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Ines found the first clean patch beneath the main work table and saw dark honeywood streaked with red. She rented Owen's random orbit sander for $14 a day. Before switching it on, she drove every proud nail below the surface with a narrow punch. Then she made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the blackened finish, 120 to erase the first scratches, and 220 to close the grain without polishing it beyond the oil's reach. Dust entered her hair, cuffs, and the seams of the window putty. She worked with the doors open despite the cold and emptied the sander bag before it grew warm. The first coat of oil disappeared into the boards almost at once. The second remained long enough to spread with linen cloth. After the third, she barred the doors and allowed a full 48-hour cure. The boards shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, not because they were hardwood, but because age and old iron had deepened the grain around each nail. One morning she woke unable to lift the sanding block. She carried her mug to the marsh and watched a great blue heron stand in the shallows, motionless except when the tide touched its legs. Ines did no work that day. At sunset, the bird opened its wings and crossed the water. She returned inside only to add wood to the stove. 8 windows faced the road. Marsh and walnut trees. 3 had no glass at all. 4 carried cracks from sash edge to sash edge. The last held 1 original pane from 1788, wavering gently through its own bubbles and thickness. Ines marked that sash with blue thread and refused to remove it. She cut replacement glass 1/8 of an inch smaller than each rabbet, laid a thin bedding line of DAP 33 glazing putty, and pressed the panes until the compound rose evenly against the interior edge. After setting glazier's points, she rolled fresh putty between her palms and tooled it into a clean bevel that shed water without showing above the sightline. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Owen supplied 1/4-inch braided cotton. Ines fed each cord over its pulley, tied a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye, and tested the balance before closing the access panel. The first sash slammed shut. She reopened the pocket, shortened the left cord by 1/2 inch, and tried again. It remained where she placed it. By the last window, February light had begun lasting beyond supper. Ines was smoothing the outer putty when a chickadee landed on a walnut branch scarcely 3 feet from the glass. Its feet gripped the wet bark, and its black head turned once toward her moving hand. She held the knife still until the bird flew. Then she finished the bevel in one uninterrupted stroke. The plaster failed first beside the chimney, where heat and settling had separated it from the hand-split oak. Ines mixed a small batch too wet, and the patch slid onto the floor before supper. The second cracked overnight. The third held until she touched its edge, then came away in one pale shell. Owen found an old feed bag of clean horsehair in his loft. She washed it, cut the longest strands, and folded them into lime plaster until the mixture pulled from the trowel without breaking. The scratch coat went on first, pressed firmly between the lath and scored with horizontal lines. She followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat, levelled it by lamplight, and allowed 72 hours of cure beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured 1/8 of an inch and required no sanding, only a steel trowel held almost flat. At the last patch, she ran her palm across the cool surface. These patches will hold another 100 years. She left the slight waviness visible. Doris began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday. She had red-framed glasses and a flower mark that seemed permanently fixed to one sleeve. Inside the bags were heel ends of bread, chowder thickened with potatoes, or 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper. When Ines tried to pay, Doris pushed the coins back across the café counter. "In candles when the shop reopens," she said. Caleb Cuff arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow at the shoulders, with one shoelace replaced by twine. Without introduction, he divided the remaining oak rounds into stove lengths and stacked them bark side upward beneath the rear awning. Ines offered him $2. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather." She did not correct the history. Somewhere in Owen's house, a family story had joined hers imperfectly, but kindly. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk toward the harbour. He wore a black coat polished at the elbows and tipped his hat, whether Ines was carrying ash, glazing a sash, or standing motionless with coffee gone cold. On the morning she repaired the loft stair, he stopped at the gate, lifted 2 fingers, and said, "Keep her walls standing." Then he walked on. The cellar remained closed until February 11th. Its hatch had been hidden beneath a warped mat in the front room, and Ines postponed opening it until the windows held and the chimney no longer shed mortar. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. The air smelled of earth, iron, and old apples. At the centre lay a dressed granite slab marked with the same thimble, brush, and threaded needle carved on the memorial stone outside. Ines cleaned the mark with a dry brush. She did not lift the slab. Beneath the 3rd step, something caught the lamplight. She reached into the narrow space and withdrew a small oak box wedged behind the riser. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into a needle passing through a square of mesh. Below it rested a tintype dated 1903. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage before the cedar shingles had silvered. She held a fine brush upright in one hand. Her face had Ines's narrow chin, level gaze, and slightly uneven brows. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Lydia Marrow, daughter of Esther. Edge 25. Summer of 1903. Ines carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel. She tried it in the desk, the tin box, the workroom cabinet, and the old frame shop door. It opened nothing. She left it beside the brass lamp, where morning light passed through the needle-shaped bow. Snow retreated from the lane in ragged islands. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with thaw water, and the walnut trees released pale catkins that shook against the restored glass. Ines cleaned Sabine's brushes but did not begin the great botanical canvas. Her hands knew miniature painting, yet the workroom carried a history she would not enter through confidence alone. She selected $1 Morgan from the cache and wrote its date in Owen's ledger. With part of it, she bought 4 small pieces of mono canvas, fresh acrylic binder, and 3 sable brushes. She practiced leaves no larger than fingernails, measuring each diagonal and counting every open hole. The first leaf bled at one edge. The second dried too pale. She kept both. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ines completed her first full needlepoint canvas. It was not the botanical garden. She painted a small chair seat showing the lightning-split walnut in late winter, its bare branches holding 1 chickadee above a narrow strip of marsh. The design used 23 colours, though from across the room it seemed to contain only brown, grey, and quiet water. She worked for 19 days, resting each layer 20 minutes and checking the mesh beneath a magnifying lens. When the final intersection dried, she held the canvas to the window. Every needle hole remained open. Doris stitched it in basket weave during slow hours at the café. The restored interior had become spare and useful. The stove drew cleanly. Oil warmed the pine floors to a deep reddish brown. White plaster followed the old walls rather than correcting them, and the north windows admitted steady light across the long table. Ines kept Adeline's tools in their original places, except for the brass gauge, which lived in her apron pocket. The key revealed its purpose during the following spring. A March gale broke a dead branch from the older walnut tree. While cutting the branch into stove lengths, Caleb noticed an oval brass plate beneath a fold of bark near the trunk's base. Moss had covered its keyhole. The needle-shaped bow fitted it exactly. Inside the tree was a narrow, copper-lined compartment, dry despite more than a century of weather. Ines removed a folded 48-star American flag, its blue field protected by linen, and a note written by Lydia Marrow during the First World War. March 29th, 1918. To the woman who finds this, my brother Nathan has gone to France with the 26th Division. He asked me to keep this flag until he returns. I place it here because trees know how to wait without pretending. Waiting is easy. If he does not come home, carry his name somewhere. It will be spoken once with care. Do not make a spectacle of him. He disliked speeches and polished shoes. The work continues upstairs. I have left the violets unfinished on the east panel because my hands shake after reading the casualty lists. Perhaps another hand will steady where mine could not. Lydia, Nathan did return, but Thomas had not. On June 6, 2025, the 81st anniversary of the Normandy landings, Ines carried Thomas Marrow's Purple Heart to the Massachusetts National Cemetery in Bourne. His name was not carved there, but the Veterans Office had confirmed his record and arranged a small archival case beside the flag for one day. No crowd gathered. Ines stood with Owen, Doris, Caleb, and Reverend Boyd while morning rain touched the glass. Reverend Boyd gave no sermon. He read Thomas's name, his unit, and the year 1944. Then they went home. Ines used only 4 coins from the cache. The first bought practice materials. The second paid for chimney brick and lime. The third covered archival storage for the flag, medal, letters, and tintype. The fourth purchased a locking steel deed box, which she lined with cedar and placed inside the repaired stretcher bar. She returned every unused banknote and coin to its wrapping. On top she laid a fresh envelope marked for the next one. The botanical garden remained outside the compartment, mounted flat beneath muslin. She had completed only 7 leaves along its southern border. The shop reopened without ceremony. Doris pinned an index card to the café corkboard, hand-painted needlepoint canvases, repairs, small designs, patient work, Marrow Loft, Eel Point Road. The first order came from a woman who wanted her mother's beach chair reproduced as a Christmas ornament. The second was a belt canvas showing 3 bluefish. By autumn, more than 40 names filled a mailing list kept in Adeline's old ledger. Ines accepted no rush orders. Customers waited. Caleb returned one November afternoon carrying a hand-carved cedar sign wrapped in an army blanket. He had grown broader through the shoulders, though one boot still bore a length of twine. The sign reproduced the old lettering, Marrow hand-painted canvases. Beneath it, on a separate board, Caleb had carved daughters. Ines traced the final S with her thumb. "There are no daughters," she said. "Not yet," Caleb answered. He meant apprentices, not children. Doris had already asked whether her niece could learn during summer. A retired teacher from Siasconset wanted to help chart colours. 2 women on the mailing list had written that their grandmothers once painted canvas but never taught them. Ines hung the smaller board beneath the original sign. It moved slightly in the wind. That winter, she began a letter of her own. She used Adeline's pine table, Sabine's brass gauge as a paperweight, and a fountain pen purchased with money earned from the bluefish belt. "My dear one, whoever you are," she wrote that the roof should be checked after every northeastern storm. She explained which floorboard near the stairs still groaned and how to prime the pump after a long freeze. She recorded the names of Owen, Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd and Mrs. Briggs because buildings were not kept by timber alone. She described the cash without naming its amount. A future keeper should understand responsibility before arithmetic. Then she added instructions for the work. Measure both diagonals. Keep the holes clear. Let adjacent colours dry. And do not discard the failed samples. They preserve the record of how a hand learned. Near midnight she stopped writing and crossed to the botanical garden. 7 completed leaves waited along the border. She threaded a needle with marsh green silk and placed 1 tent stitch through the first painted intersection of the 8th leaf. Life is filled by the smallest stitches, not by long hurried threads. Ines left the needle resting in the canvas and lowered the lamp. Outside, snow gathered on the cedar sign, softened the gravel lane, and settled in the repaired seams of the roof without entering them. The needlepoint canvas painter's loft waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Eleanor Briggs retired the following summer. While clearing her desk, she found a worn $1 bill beneath the transparent pad, held flat beside a copy of the $7 deed. She placed both in the bottom drawer for the next clerk. Then she closed it carefully.